The emergency room at Naval Medical Center, San Diego hummed with controlled chaos on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Commander Richard Nakamura, a SEAL Team Admiral with 28 years of service etched into the lines around his eyes, sat in the waiting area with a dislocated shoulder from a training exercise gone wrong. He watched the nurses move with practiced efficiency, their scrubs swishing past gurneys and worried families. One nurse caught his attention, not because she was particularly remarkable at first glance, but because of what hung around her neck. Dog tags, worn outside her scrubs, resting against the faded fabric like a declaration. Most medical personnel didn't wear them that way. Most didn't wear them at all unless they were active duty, and she clearly wasn't. Her name tag read K. Vance, RN. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory, checking vitals on a young Marine who couldn't have been more than 20. The way she steadied his arm suggested she'd done this before, in circumstances far worse than a clean hospital with working lights and unlimited supplies. Nakamura shifted in his seat, wincing as his shoulder protested. The nurse, Vance, glanced his way, and for just a moment their eyes met. Hers were the color of winter storms, gray and unreadable. She nodded once, a gesture that carried weight, then returned to her patient. The dog tags caught the fluorescent light as she moved, metal glinting like a signal mirror in hostile territory. Commander Nakamura, a corpsman, appeared with a wheelchair. "We're ready for you now." "I can walk," he said, standing carefully. "Hospital policy, sir. You know how it is." He did. Protocol was protocol, even when it felt ridiculous. As the corpsman wheeled him past the nurse's station, he caught another glimpse of Vance. She was leaning over a computer terminal, one hand absently touching those tags. The gesture was unconscious, the way a widow might touch her wedding ring. There was a story there. Nakamura had been in the Navy long enough to recognize the weight people carried. He'd seen it in the faces of men who'd lost their teammates, in the eyes of pilots who'd barely made it back, in the set of shoulders that had borne too much for too long. The tags bothered him, not their presence. Plenty of people wore dog tags for various reasons, but the way she wore them, like they were both burden and lifeline, like they meant something that went deeper than metal and regulation stamping. He filed the observation away as the corpsman pushed him through swinging doors toward radiology. He didn't expect to see her again. The Navy was vast, and their paths had crossed only by accident of injury and shift rotation. But the universe had different plans. 3 hours later, shoulder relocated and wrapped in a sling that made him feel like a geriatric tourist, Nakamura returned to the waiting area to find Captain James Howell, his former squadron commander from Iraq, sitting exactly where he'd been earlier. "Jim," Nakamura approached, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Howell looked up, and the expression on his face made Nakamura's instincts sharpen. The captain's eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw tight. "My daughter, emergency appendectomy. She's in surgery now." "Christ, Jim, is she going to be okay?" They said yes, routine, but you know how it is, doesn't feel routine when it's your kid. Howell rubbed his face with both hands. "Been here since 0400. Nakamura sat down beside him, careful of his shoulder. They'd flown together in Desert Storm, back when the world was younger and they believed themselves invincible. Wars and decades had taught them differently. They sat in the companionable silence of men who'd shared foxholes and fear, waiting for news that would either break or spare a father's heart. Vance emerged from the double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," pushing a gurney with an elderly man who smiled up at her like she'd hung the moon. She transferred him to his wife's care with gentle efficiency, explaining medication schedules and warning signs to watch for. Her voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that could talk someone through a crisis without raising the pulse rate. "That's the nurse I was telling you about," Howell said suddenly, following Nakamura's gaze. "The one who stayed with Jenny before they took her back, held her hand, talked her through the fear. Jenny said she felt safer with her there." He paused. "She's got a kid too, single mom. I heard some of the other nurses talking. Nakamura watched as Vance returned to the nurse's station, those dog tags swinging slightly with her movement. The pieces were assembling in his mind like fragments of intelligence from multiple sources, forming a picture he couldn't yet see clearly. Single mother. Navy dog tags worn with purpose. The way she moved through chaos with unshakable calm. The muscle memory in her hands when she touched that young Marine's arm. Commander Nakamura, a different nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. We need you to sign some discharge papers. He rose, still watching Vance. She'd pulled her dark hair back into a ponytail, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and a small scar that traced from just below her left ear down toward her collarbone. It was the kind of scar that came from something serious, something violent. The kind of scar that told stories its bearer probably wished would stay silent. "Sir," the nurse prompted. "Right, sorry." He followed her to the desk, but his mind remained on the mystery of the woman in scrubs who wore her past around her neck like an albatross dressed as remembrance. The day moved forward. Howell's daughter came through surgery perfectly, and the captain's relief was palpable enough to feel across the waiting room. Nakamura's shoulder throbbed despite the pain medication, a metronome of discomfort that kept him grounded in the present moment. He should have left hours ago. Should have gone home to his wife, and the quiet house where his uniform hung in a closet that smelled of cedar and old leather. But something kept him there. Call it instinct. Call it the recognition of a fellow traveler on roads most people never walked. Call it the simple human need to understand why someone would wear dog tags like a promise that couldn't be broken. Vance finished her shift at 1400 hours. Nakamura watched her gather her things from a locker in the break room. The door had been propped open by someone seeking air circulation in the stuffy space. She pulled on a worn leather jacket that had seen better years, checked her phone with the particular anxiety of a parent confirming childcare arrangements, and headed for the exit. He intercepted her in the hallway, not entirely sure what he intended to say. "Excuse me, Miss Vance." His voice carried the authority of decades of command, but he softened it with what he hoped was approachable curiosity. She turned, and up close he could see the exhaustion that lived in the fine lines around her eyes. 12-hour shifts left their mark. "Commander, how's the shoulder?" "Better, thanks to you and your team." He hesitated, knowing he was about to cross a line that might not be welcome. "I couldn't help but notice." He gestured toward his own chest, indicating the dog tags. Her hand moved to them automatically, defensive. "They're not stolen, if that's what you're implying." "Not at all, he chose his words carefully. "I've been in the Navy a long time. I recognize when something means more than it appears to." For a long moment she studied him with those storm-gray eyes. Then something shifted in her expression, a wall lowering just enough to let light through. "They were my pilots," she said quietly. "I was his crew chief. Served together for 4 years before." She stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished between them like smoke. "Before," Nakamura prompted gently. "Before we lost him." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the fractures beneath. 8 years ago last month. His name was Lieutenant Elias Mercer. He flew helicopters, SAR missions mostly, search and rescue. The name rang no bells, but that didn't mean anything. The Navy was vast, and not every hero made the news. He was a good pilot. "The best I ever worked with." There was fierce pride in her voice now. He could fly through conditions that would ground anyone else. Saved 43 lives over his career. 43 people who went home because he refused to accept impossible. "And the 44th?" Nakamura asked, already knowing the answer. Her jaw tightened. "Never made it home." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily, measuring someone's heartbeat in digital certainty. Vance's fingers curled around the dog tags, and Nakamura saw it then. The ritual of touch, the prayer without words, the conversation with ghosts that only the living could hear. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with the weight of every loss he'd ever carried. She nodded once, acknowledgement without acceptance. I should go. My son gets out of school in 20 minutes. Of course. He stepped aside, then added, Thank you for your service, petty officer. She stopped mid-step, turning back slowly. How did you know my rank? The way you move. The way you spoke about your pilot. Crew chiefs don't just work with pilots, they own them. That's a relationship built on trust most people never understand. He paused. And I checked your file after I saw the tags, called in a favor with personnel. Instead of anger, she showed something that might have been respect. That's thorough of you, sir. Old habits. He offered a slight smile. For what it's worth, your pilot was lucky to have you watching his six. Not lucky enough, she said, and walked away before he could respond. Nakamura stood in the empty hallway, his shoulder aching and his mind turning over the brief conversation like stones in a tumbler, searching for facets and meaning. Lieutenant Elias Mercer, search and rescue pilot, lost 8 years ago. The pieces were there, but the picture remained incomplete. That night, unable to sleep despite his wife's gentle breathing beside him, Nakamura sat in his home office with a glass of bourbon and his laptop. He pulled every string he had, called in favors from people in personnel and operations, dove into classified mission reports that he technically shouldn't access for personal reasons. But this wasn't personal. Not exactly. This was about understanding the weight that Vance carried, about honoring what she wore around her neck like both memory and mission statement. The files loaded slowly, each page revealing layers of a story that made his breath catch. Lieutenant Elias Mercer, call sign Shepard, was 34 when he died. He'd been married to Kira Vance for 2 years, husband and wife united by more than love, by the unique bond between pilot and crew chief, between people who trusted each other with their lives every time they lifted off. Their son, Mason, had been 6 months old when Mercer took his last flight. The mission report was clinical in its brutality. A civilian yacht capsized in a storm 70 miles off the coast, 3 adults, 2 children in the water. Conditions were beyond operational limits, 60-knot winds, 20-foot swells, visibility near zero. Command had recommended waiting for the storm to pass. Mercer had gone anyway, because Shepard never left his flock behind. The helicopter had lifted into hell itself, and somehow, impossibly, he'd pulled 4 people from the water. 4 lives snatched from the Pacific's cold embrace. He'd been going back for the 5th when the engine failed. Not mechanical error, just the physics of metal pushed beyond its limits, turbines choked with salt spray and stress, rotors fighting winds that turned air into concrete. The helicopter went down hard. The co-pilot and rescue swimmer survived with injuries. Mercer died on impact. His body recovered 3 days later when the storm finally exhausted itself. The 5th person, a 9-year-old girl, drowned while her mother watched from the rescue helicopter, safe but broken. Nakamura closed the laptop and drained his bourbon in one burning swallow. He understood now. Understood why Vance wore those tags. Why she'd left active duty but stayed close to the Navy through civilian work. Why she moved through the emergency room with the calm of someone who'd already survived the worst moment of her life and knew that nothing else could ever truly touch her. She wore them because some promises transcend death, because love doesn't end when the heart stops, because the man who'd saved 43 lives deserved to be remembered by the woman who'd kept his aircraft flying, who'd trusted him with her life and heart, who'd borne his son and raised that boy alone in the shadow of heroism. The next morning, Nakamura returned to the hospital, not because he needed medical attention, but because he had questions only Vance could answer. He found her during her break, sitting outside in the courtyard where medical personnel came to steal moments of peace between crises. She was eating a sandwich with the mechanical efficiency of someone fueling rather than enjoying, her eyes on the cloudless sky. Commander, no surprise in her voice. She'd probably seen him coming. May I sit? She gestured to the empty bench. Free country, mostly. He sat careful of his shoulder. I read about Lieutenant Mercer, about the mission. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away from the sky. Then you know why I wear these. I know what happened. I don't know why you left the Navy afterward. Your record was exemplary. You could have had a career. I had a 6-month-old son and no husband. The Navy couldn't give me what I needed anymore. Her voice was flat, factual. And every time I saw a helicopter, every time I heard rotor wash, I was back in that storm, waiting for news that never came. But you stayed close, working here with military personnel. Because they're my people, because I understand what they're carrying. She finally looked at him, and the intensity in her eyes was startling. You didn't come back just to talk about Eli. No, he admitted. I came because I've been in command for nearly 3 decades, and I've learned that the people who carry the most weight are often the ones no one sees. You're invisible here, Ms. Vance. Just another nurse in scrubs, but I see what you are. And what's that? A warrior who changed uniforms but never stopped serving. He let that settle between them. I'm running a program, informal, off the books. We bring in veterans, especially those with aviation backgrounds, to mentor the next generation, share experiences, provide perspective that you can't get from a manual. She was already shaking her head. I'm not a pilot, I was a crew chief. There's a difference. The difference is exactly why I want you. Pilots need to understand the people who keep them alive. The crew chiefs, the mechanics, the tower operators, all the voices in their ears when everything goes wrong. He paused. And they need to understand what happens to the people left behind when heroes don't come home. That's cruel. That's reality, and reality is the best teacher we have. He pulled a business card from his pocket, standard Navy issue with his contact information. Think about it. The program meets twice a month. No formal commitment. Just show up, tell your story, answer questions from kids who think they're invincible. She took the card, studying it like it might detonate. Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe Eli anything. I care because I've lost good people. Because I've signed letters to families and stood at funerals and wondered if anything I did mattered. His voice roughened slightly. And I care because someone needs to make sure Lieutenant Mercer's legacy is more than dog tags and a mission report. She was quiet for a long time. In the distance, a helicopter flew overhead, probably a medical transport, rotor blades cutting the air into rhythmic thunder. She didn't flinch, but her hand found the dog tags again, that unconscious gesture of connection to something beyond reach. I'll think about it, she finally said. It was neither yes nor no, but Nakamura recognized the opening when he heard it. That's all I'm asking. He stood, his shoulder protesting the movement. For what it's worth, Ms. Vance, your husband would be proud of who you've become. You didn't know him. I know he married a woman strong enough to survive losing him. That tells me everything I need to know about his judgment. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone with the sky and her ghosts and the question of whether the past could serve the future. 3 weeks passed. Nakamura heard nothing from Vance and assumed she'd decided against it. The program continued without her, pilots and crew members sharing stories with wide-eyed recruits who hadn't yet learned that courage and fear were conjoined twins. Then, on a Tuesday evening that felt like all the other Tuesday evenings, she appeared. The meeting was held in a conference room at North Island Naval Air Station, informal enough to encourage conversation but structured enough to maintain focus. Nakamura was mid-sentence, explaining the difference between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment, when he saw her slip through the door. She wore jeans and a black sweater, civilian clothes that somehow made the dog tags more visible. Her presence shifted the energy in the room without her saying a word. The 20 young aviators and crew members sensed it, the way predators sense apex competition, the way students recognize a teacher who's earned their authority through experience rather than rank. Ms. Vance, Nakamura said, barely missing a beat. Glad you could join us. Everyone, this is Kira Vance. She served as a crew chief on SAR helicopters. Kira, you're just in time. We were discussing risk assessment. She found an empty seat near the back, nodding to the curious faces that turned her way. One of the young pilots, a lieutenant junior grade with an attitude that practically radiated from his pressed uniform, muttered something to his neighbor. Nakamura couldn't hear the words, but he caught the tone, dismissive, slightly mocking, the kind of attitude that got people killed. "You have something to add, Lieutenant Briggs." Nakamura's voice cut through the murmur. Briggs straightened, clearly not expecting to be called out. "No, sir. I mean, with all respect to Ms. Vance, she's a crew chief. We're here to learn from pilots." The room went silent. Several of the more experienced personnel winced, recognizing the mistake. Vance remained still, her expression unreadable, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Nakamura smiled, and it wasn't kind. "Lieutenant, how many hours do you have?" 83, sir, mostly training flights." 83 hours, impressive. The sarcasm was surgical. "Ms. Vance, how many flight hours did you log during your service?" She spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the silent room. "A little over 3,000, give or take." The number landed like ordnance. Briggs's face went red. 3,000 hours meant she'd spent the equivalent of 4 months in the air, not counting ground time, maintenance, briefings, and all the other endless hours that comprised a deployment. She'd forgotten more about helicopters than most of these kids would learn in their first 5 years. "Lieutenant Briggs," Nakamura continued, "crew chiefs don't just maintain aircraft, they fly in them. They know every sound, every vibration, every warning sign that something's about to go catastrophically wrong. They're the ones who tap pilots on the shoulder and say, 'We have a problem,' and pilots who ignore that tap don't last long." He paused. "I suggest you listen when Ms. Vance speaks. You might learn something that saves your life someday." Briggs nodded, properly chastened. "Yes, sir, sorry, ma'am." Vance acknowledged the apology with a slight nod but didn't seem particularly moved by it. She'd probably heard worse. Nakamura gestured for her to come forward. "Kira, would you mind sharing some of your experience with the group?" She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she stood and walked to the front with that distinctive economy of motion. Up close, under the fluorescent lights, the years showed more clearly, lines around her eyes, gray threading through her dark hair, the weariness of someone who'd carried too much for too long. "I'm not much for speeches," she began, "but Commander Nakamura asked me here to talk about risk, so I'll tell you about a mission. December 2016. We got a call about a fishing vessel taking on water 40 miles out in the middle of a winter storm. 3 crew members, water temperature around 48 degrees. They had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia made rescue impossible." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to the dog tags. "My pilot, Lieutenant Mercer, call sign Shepard, he took one look at the weather report and said we were going. The operations officer told him it was too dangerous, told him to wait for the storm to pass. My pilot asked how long that would take. The officer said maybe 3 hours. My pilot said, 'They'll be dead in 30 minutes,' and walked out to the bird." The room was absolutely still. Even Briggs had lost his cockiness, caught in the gravity of a story that was clearly heading toward tragedy. "I did my pre-flight in conditions that should have grounded us. Wind shear that could flip the helicopter, ice forming on everything, visibility so bad I could barely see the rotor blades. And I knew," her voice caught slightly, "I knew this was the kind of mission where something could go wrong, where the margin for error was so thin it basically didn't exist." "But you went anyway," someone said quietly. "We went anyway, because that's what search and rescue means. It means you go when everyone else says it's impossible. It means you fly into hell because 3 people you've never met are counting on you to be better than the circumstances." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that had started skeptical and were now riveted. "We pulled all 3 of them out, hypothermic, terrified, but alive." And we did it because my pilot was the best I ever worked with. And because I kept that aircraft running through conditions that should have killed it. But something did go wrong eventually, Nakamura said gently, didn't it? Her expression went distant, looking at something beyond the walls of the conference room. 8 years ago, similar situation, different storm. We saved 4 people. Would have saved 5, but the aircraft finally gave up. Engines quit, rotors failed. Eli, Lieutenant Mercer, he kept us stable long enough for most of the crew to survive. But he didn't make it. The silence was absolute. This wasn't the sanitized version of heroism they saw in recruitment videos. This was the raw truth of what happened when courage met the inevitable limits of metal and physics and human endurance. I wear his dog tags, Vance continued, because he represents what we're supposed to be. Someone who understood that risk and accepted it anyway because the mission was more important than coming home safe. But I also wear them as a reminder of the cost. She looked directly at Briggs. Every time you go up, every time you push limits, remember that there are people on the ground who love you, who need you, who will have to live with the consequences of your decisions long after you're gone. She fell silent, and Nakamura let the moment breathe. These kids needed to sit with that truth, needed to feel the weight of what they were signing up for. Aviation wasn't just about skill and courage. It was about understanding that heroism had a price tag, and sometimes other people had to pay it. "Thank you, Kira," he said finally. "Questions?" Hands went up all around the room. The questions came fast. Technical details about the mission, about crew chief responsibilities, about how to know when risk was acceptable versus suicidal. Vance answered each one with the precision of someone who'd lived the scenarios they were imagining. She spoke about pre-flight checks that saved lives, about the subtle sounds that indicated bearing failure, about the split-second decisions that separated success from catastrophe. But the most powerful moment came near the end, when a young woman in the front row, a rescue swimmer based on her insignia, raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Vance, do you regret it? Staying in, I mean, knowing how it ended?" Vance was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that my son grew up without his father. I regret that Eli never got to see Mason learn to ride a bike or graduate elementary school or any of the 1,000 small moments that make up a life." Her voice was steady, but emotion ran beneath it like deep water. "But do I regret serving? Do I regret the missions, the saves, the people who got to go home because we refused to quit? No, never." The swimmer nodded, blinking back tears. The room had transformed from skeptical to reverent, from a group of cocky kids who thought they knew what courage looked like to people beginning to understand the real weight of the uniform. After the meeting ended, several of the young aviators approached Vance with additional questions. Nakamura watched from across the room as she patiently explained hydraulic systems and emergency protocols, her hands moving in the unconscious gestures of someone who could rebuild a helicopter blindfolded. Lieutenant Briggs was among them, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "You were right to bring her," said a voice beside Nakamura. Captain Sarah Mendez, the base's operations officer, had slipped in during the latter half of the meeting. "That was the most engaged I've seen a group in months." "She has a gift for truth," Nakamura replied. "No polish, no propaganda, just the reality of what we do and what it costs." The dog tags are a powerful symbol. They're more than a symbol. They're a promise she makes every day to keep her husband's memory alive, to honor what he stood for. He paused. "And I think they're also her way of staying connected to who she used to be, before she was just a single mother and a nurse, when she was part of something that mattered." Mendez gave him a sharp look. "Be careful, Rick. Sounds like you're getting personally invested." "Maybe I am. Maybe that's not a bad thing." He watched as Vance finally extricated herself from the group of admirers, exhaustion clear in the set of her shoulders. "We spend so much time talking about the warriors who die in combat. Maybe we need to spend more time honoring the ones who survive and keep serving in different ways." spoken like someone who's thinking about retirement. Nakamura smiled, spoken like someone who's starting to understand that legacy is more than ribbons and medals. Across the room, Vance caught his eye. She nodded once, acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude, and headed for the door. He let her go. She'd given enough for one evening. But as he gathered his materials and prepared to head home, he felt the satisfaction of knowing he'd been right. Her story mattered. Her presence mattered. The dog tags she wore weren't just remembrance. They were a bridge between past and future, between the dead and the living, between the hero who'd fallen and the heroes who would rise to take his place. The program continued through the spring. Vance became a semi-regular presence, showing up every few weeks to share pieces of her experience. She never volunteered more than necessary, never sought the spotlight, but when she spoke, people listened. The young aviators began to understand what Nakamura had recognized from the beginning, that she represented something essential about service that had nothing to do with rank or glory. Mason, her son, turned 9 that April. Nakamura learned this when Vance had to reschedule a session because of a school event. "He's in his father's footsteps already," she'd said with a mixture of pride and dread. "Obsessed with helicopters, wants to be a pilot when he grows up." "How do you feel about that?" She'd been quiet for a long moment, terrified, but Eli always said fear was just information. What you do with it is what matters. The word stayed with Nakamura. Fear was just information. It was the kind of wisdom that came from living through the worst-case scenario and discovering that survival was possible even when it didn't feel like it. He thought about it during his own sessions, when he talked to young pilots about decision-making under pressure, about the difference between courage and stupidity. In May, something shifted. Vance arrived at a session with a box under her arm. "I thought it was time," she said to Nakamura before the meeting started, "to share more of who Eli was, not just how he died, but how he lived." The box contained photographs. Eli Mercer in his flight suit, standing beside his helicopter with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in the sky. Mercer with his crew, laughing at some joke lost to time. Mercer and Vance on their wedding day, both in dress uniform, her head on his shoulder and his hand gentle on her waist. And one photograph that made Nakamura's throat tight. Mercer holding infant Mason, the baby impossibly tiny against his father's chest, and the expression on the pilot's face one of such pure love and wonder that it hurt to witness. "I want them to understand," Vance said quietly, arranging the photos on a table at the front of the room, "that he wasn't just a call sign and a mission report. He was real. He loved stupid action movies and burnt toast and terrible jokes. He cried when Mason was born. He was scared sometimes and brave anyway. He was human." The session that night was different. Vance didn't just tell them about missions and technical procedures. She told them about the man, about how Mercer would check every inch of the helicopter himself before flights, running his hands over metal like a prayer, about how he knew the names of every person on base, from the Admiral to the janitor, about how he'd sing off-key to stay alert during long missions, driving his co-pilot crazy with mangled country lyrics. She told them about the morning of his last flight, how he'd kissed her before leaving, nothing special or prophetic, just the casual affection of people who expected forever. How he'd texted her a photo of sunrise from the cockpit with the message, "Office view today." How she'd been changing Mason's diaper when the call came, the commanding officer's voice careful and formal, and how she'd known from the first word that her world had just ended. "I'm not telling you this to scare you," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of memory. "I'm telling you because someone needs to, because they'll send notifications to your families too if you're not careful, if you're not smart, if you push too far past the limits of what's possible." She touched the dog tags. "Eli was the best pilot I ever knew, and it still wasn't enough. Sometimes courage and skill aren't enough. Sometimes the universe just takes what it wants, and there's nothing you can do except survive it." In the back row, Lieutenant Briggs had tears on his face. He wasn't alone. The room had transformed from a classroom into something approaching sacred space, the place where truth was told without flinching, where the cost of service was laid bare for everyone to see. After the session, a young pilot named Chen approached Vance. "My dad was Navy," she said quietly. "Died in a training accident when I was 7. I barely remember him, but my mom, she never really recovered. Remarried eventually, but there was always this distance, like part of her died with him." Vance looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and Nakamura saw recognition pass between them. The understanding shared by those who knew what it meant to love someone whose job was to fly into danger. "Does she support your choice to serve?" "She didn't speak to me for 6 months after I enlisted. She's better now, but I know she's scared every time I go up." Chen paused. "Seeing you here, seeing what you've become, it helps. Knowing that survival is possible." "Survival is always possible," Vance said. "It just doesn't look like you think it will. It's messy and hard, and some days you don't want to get out of bed, but you do. For your kid or your shipmates, or just because giving up would dishonor what they stood for." She glanced at Nakamura, then back to Chen. "Your mother is scared because she loves you. That's not weakness. That's the price of loving someone brave." The conversation continued long after the official session ended. Small groups clustered around Vance, asking questions, sharing their own stories and fears. Nakamura stood back and watched his initial instinct prove true. Vance was exactly what this program needed. Not someone polished and perfect, but someone real and broken and still standing. Someone who proved that service didn't end with active duty, that meaning could be found in continuing the mission in different forms. As the crowd finally dispersed and Vance gathered her photographs, carefully placing each one back in the box, Nakamura approached. "That was extraordinary," he said. "Thank you." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. This is—" She paused, searching for words. "This is the first time in 8 years that talking about Eli didn't feel like drowning. It felt like diving, like going deep deliberately instead of being pulled under. The difference between control and chaos." "Exactly." She closed the box, her movements reverent. "Mason asked me last week why I still wear the tags. He said his friend's mom told him it was morbid, keeping pieces of the dead around." Nakamura felt his jaw tighten. "What did you tell him?" "I told him they're not pieces of the dead. They're proof that his father lived, that he mattered, that love doesn't end just because someone's gone." She met Nakamura's eyes. "And I told him that someday, when he's old enough to understand, I'll explain what these tags represent. Not death, but the willingness to risk everything for something that matters more than safety. He's lucky to have you. He's cursed to have his father's courage and his mother's stubbornness. God help the Navy when he enlists." But there was affection in her voice, the complicated pride of a mother who knew her child was destined for challenges she couldn't prevent. Nakamura walked her to her car, an old Honda with a faded Navy Mom bumper sticker and a crack in the windshield that probably cost more to fix than she could easily afford. Nursing paid decently, but single parenthood on a civilian salary was a different kind of combat. No medals awarded, no backup arriving, just the daily grind of making it work. "Kira," he said as she opened the door, "have you ever considered coming back? Not active duty necessarily, but there are positions for experienced personnel, training roles, safety inspections, program management." She was quiet, leaning against the car door. "I think about it sometimes. Late at night when Mason's asleep and the house is too quiet, I think about the smell of hydraulic fluid and rotor wash and the weight of a helmet. I think about being part of something bigger than myself again." She paused. "But then I remember that I already did my part, that I gave the Navy everything I had, including the person I loved most, and maybe that's enough." "It's more than enough," Nakamura agreed. "But the offer stands if you ever change your mind." She nodded, got in the car, and drove away into the California night. Nakamura stood in the parking lot, watching her taillights disappear, and thought about legacy. About how some people's impact rippled out in ways they never saw, touching lives they never knew existed, changing futures they'd never witness. Lieutenant Elias Shepard Mercer had saved 43 lives in his career, but through his widow, through the story she carried and shared, through the dog tags that sparked conversations and questions, how many more lives would he save? How many young aviators would fly smarter, think harder, push back against dangerous orders because they'd heard Kira Vance talk about the cost of heroism? Legacy wasn't just about what you did. It was about what persisted after you were gone, the echoes of your choices reverberating through time like sonar pings in deep water, mapping terrain you'd never see but others would navigate because you'd been there first. The summer brought changes. Nakamura's shoulder finally healed completely, the ache fading to nothing more than weather prediction, a slight twinge when rain approached, the body's memory of injury. The program continued to grow, adding more veterans, expanding to other bases. Vance's story became something of a legend among the young aviators, whispered about in ready rooms and recalled during moments of doubt. But Nakamura noticed something else too. Vance was changing. The exhaustion that had lived in her eyes was gradually being replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Not the absence of pain, that never truly left those who'd lost deeply, but the integration of grief into a larger narrative. The transformation from victim of tragedy to guardian of memory. In August, she showed up at Nakamura's office unannounced. He looked up from paperwork to find her standing in the doorway, and the expression on her face made him set down his pen immediately. "Mason wants to meet you," she said without preamble. "He's been asking questions about the program, about his father's service. I told him about you and he said—" She paused, and for the first time since he'd known her, Vance looked uncertain. "He said he wants to talk to someone who understands what his dad did, someone who can explain why it mattered." Nakamura felt the weight of that request, 9 years old and already carrying questions too big for childhood. "I'd be honored. When?" "Saturday we could meet at the beach, somewhere neutral, not all military and official." "The beach sounds perfect." Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect San Diego weather that made people forget California had problems. Nakamura met them at Silver Strand Beach, where the Pacific was gentle and families dotted the sand like colorful confetti. He spotted Vance immediately. She wore jeans and a gray t-shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders, the dog tags visible at her throat. The boy beside her had his father's build, lean and tall for his age, with Vance's storm-gray eyes and a curiosity that practically radiated from him. "Mason," Vance said, "this is Commander Nakamura. Commander, my son Mason Mercer." The boy shook hands with surprising formality. "Nice to meet you, sir. Mom says you knew my dad." "I didn't know him personally," Nakamura admitted, crouching to be at eye level. "But I know what he did, what he stood for. Your mother has told me a lot about him." They walked along the beach, the three of them, while Mason asked questions. Some were practical. What kind of helicopter did his father fly? How fast could it go? What did all the controls do? Others were deeper, the kind that showed a child trying to understand a parent he'd never really known. Was he scared when he went on missions? Nakamura glanced at Vance, who nodded permission. "Probably. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It means you understand the risks and choose to act anyway." "Mom says he saved lots of people." 43 confirmed. Maybe more that we don't know about. Your father was one of the best at what he did. Mason was quiet for a moment, kicking at the sand. "He died saving someone, right? That's what Mom said." "He died trying to save someone," Nakamura corrected gently. "Sometimes even heroes can't win. Sometimes the ocean or the storm or the situation is just too much, but that doesn't make the attempt any less important." The boy processed this, his young face serious. The girl he couldn't save, did she die because of him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Vance stopped walking, her hand moving to the dog tags in that unconscious gesture of connection. Nakamura understood the weight of this moment. the narrative that would shape how Mason understood his father's death, the story that would either honor or haunt. "No," he said firmly. "She died because sometimes bad things happen in the world. Your father went into impossible conditions to try to stop those bad things. He saved 4 people that day. 4 families who got to keep someone they loved. The fact that he couldn't save everyone doesn't diminish what he accomplished." But Mom was sad for a long time. "Your mom was sad because she loved your father very much, because she lost someone irreplaceable. That sadness isn't wrong, it's proof of how much they mattered to each other." Mason looked up at his mother, and something passed between them that Nakamura couldn't fully read. Understanding, maybe. Permission to ask the questions that had been building. "Do you think he would have been a good dad?" Vance's breath hitched, but her voice was steady when she answered. "He already was a good dad. He loved you from the moment he knew you existed. He used to sing to my belly before you were born, terrible, off-key songs that made me laugh. He had plans for teaching you to swim and camp and fly kites. Just because he didn't get to do those things doesn't mean he wasn't your dad. But you had to do everything alone. I had help. I had my family and your dad's family and the Navy community. But yes, I had to be both parents. That's hard sometimes." She knelt beside him, hands on his shoulders. "But you know what? Every time I look at you, I see him. Your smile, your curiosity, the way you study things before you touch them, that's all him. So in a way, he's still here, still being your dad through the person you're becoming." Mason hugged her fiercely, and Nakamura turned away to give them privacy. He walked toward the water, giving them space to grieve and heal in their own way. The Pacific stretched to the horizon, endless and indifferent, the same ocean that had claimed Elias Mercer and countless others who dared to challenge its supremacy. After a few minutes, Mason joined him at the water's edge. "Commander, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Mom wears Dad's tags all the time. Do you think," he hesitated, "do you think I could get a pair, like made for me, so I can remember him too?" Nakamura looked down at this serious 9-year-old who was trying so hard to understand legacy and loss and felt something shift in his chest. "I think that's a great idea. I can help with that. We'll get them made exactly right. Your father's name, your birth date. Something to connect you to him." "Would that be weird, having tags when I'm not in the Navy?" "Your mother wears them and she's not in the Navy anymore. They're not about active duty. They're about connection, about carrying someone with you." He paused. "And who knows, maybe someday you'll earn your own and you can wear them together." The boy's face lit up with possibility, and Nakamura recognized the seed being planted. The idea that service was both birthright and choice, legacy and future intertwined like the metal links of a chain that stretched across generations. They spent another hour at the beach, talking about helicopters and history, about courage and fear, about the complicated truth that heroes were also human beings who loved and laughed and sometimes sang off-key. Mason's questions gradually shifted from his father to the work Nakamura did, the pilots he trained, the missions that shaped lives. "Do you think Mom could fly?" Mason asked suddenly. "Like, as a pilot instead of a crew chief?" "She has the skills. Crew chiefs understand aircraft better than most pilots ever will. The question is whether she wants to. She never talks about going back. Sometimes the past hurts too much to revisit, even when it was good." Mason considered this with the gravity of someone older than his years. "But she talks about Dad at those meetings you have, at the base. That's different. That's honoring his memory by helping others. That's turning pain into purpose." Nakamura glanced back toward Vance, who stood watching them with an expression that was equal parts love and sorrow. "Your mother is one of the strongest people I've ever met. She survived something that would have destroyed most people, and she's still finding ways to serve." "When I grow up," Mason said with sudden certainty, "I want to be like both of them, strong like Mom, brave like Dad." "Then the Navy will be lucky to have you, but there's no rush. Enjoy being a kid first. Your parents would want that." They rejoined Vance, and the three of them walked back to the parking lot as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. Before they parted, Mason hugged Nakamura with the unself-conscious affection of a child who decided someone was trustworthy. "Thanks for telling me about my dad." "Anytime, Mason. You ever want to talk more, you just have your mom call me." After they'd gone, Nakamura sat in his car for a long time, watching the beach empty as families gathered their belongings and headed home. He thought about the strange web of connections that had brought him to that emergency room months ago, the dislocated shoulder that had led to noticing dog tags, the curiosity that had driven him to learn Kira Vance's story. Sometimes the universe arranged things with a precision that felt almost deliberate, as if certain people needed to cross paths, certain stories needed to be told, certain legacies needed stewards to carry them forward when the original bearers could no longer hold the weight. He started the engine and drove home to his wife, who would ask about his day and listen with the patience of someone who'd spent decades learning to read his silences. He would tell her about Mason and Vance, about a father's legacy living in his son's questions, about a widow who transformed grief into service. And his wife would nod and say what she always said, that he had a gift for seeing the value in people others overlooked. But Nakamura knew it wasn't a gift. It was just attention. It was just caring enough to look past the surface and recognize that everyone carried stories, that the woman in scrubs with dog tags around her neck was more than what she appeared, that the serious 9-year-old asking about his father was inheriting more than genes. He was inheriting a mandate to matter, to serve, to carry forward something that transcended individual lives. The tags Kira wore weren't just metal and ink. They were a promise made new each morning, a declaration that love persisted beyond death, that service continued even when the uniform came off, that heroes never truly died as long as someone remained to speak their names and honor what they'd stood for. And maybe that was the real mission, not the rescues or the medals or the battles won, but the simple act of remembering, of keeping vigil for the fallen, of making sure that sacrifice meant something more than statistics in a report. The summer faded into autumn, and with it came changes that would alter everything.